give over a hand to Beth Braun.
Thank you. Thank you. Hello. Oh, the mic is on. I asked them to turn it off earlier because I had to go to the loo, and that would have been very embarrassing, wouldn't it? I apologise in advance. I have a tendency to shout because I don't normally have a mic, and I'm also quite short, and I grew up with 2 older brothers, so the only way to be heard was to shout. So if I start shouting, tell me to shh, right? So just go shh. So, as kindly introduced, my name's Beth, and I am currently the DevOps lead in EMEA for EMC. What that means, varied things. I'm an evangelist both internally and externally, so I go out to customers and talk about how we do DevOps internally and also how we can help customers do DevOps. And I'm also internally, I've got a team of 20 plus people who I help train into the new technologies and help support in terms of innovation. In fact, one of the slides I've got later on is an MVP that we're doing internally, all about having a hybrid DevOps cloud, which I'll talk you through, and that's all my team, so very proud of those guys. My history, long time ago, long time ago, I was a PL1 developer. Anybody remember PL1? Wow, you're as old as me. That's great. Makes me feel better. And then I moved into Delphi, Borland. So yeah, Object Pascal. Then Java, and then a lot of Agile. So big Agile evangelist, which probably isn't surprising when you think about the connection with DevOps. It's pretty much a symbiotic relationship. I haven't been hands-on for quite some time, so please don't ask me anything too technically challenging, because I will just have to defer to one of my team. But I sort of oversee the overall approach. So to start off with, I thought it'd be a good idea just to baseline what we define as DevOps. And I know you've had lots of these slides over the last day, so I'll be very, very quick. I love the Phoenix Project. Who's read the Phoenix Project? By the way, this is an interactive session. Yes, it is one of the best books out there. Has the DevOps Cookbook been published yet? It's soon to be published, I think. Where they're going to talk about the 3 ways in more detail, which is a big key part of the Phoenix Project. If you've not read the Phoenix Project, by the way, definitely suggest you get a copy, or you can get it on Audible if you want. And it talks about some really good principles in terms of what's important. So I've boiled those into our definition. DevOps is optimizing flow, maximizing feedback, and building a culture of innovation and learning. And I've summarized it up there. And the idea is that we're creating valuable products more quickly. I think what's forgotten a lot is the final bit, experimentation. It is what we're doing today, you all know this, totally cutting edge, right? We're probably making a lot of this up as we go along. It really is all about experimentation. And I think that should be the first thing in the list in some respects, rather than the last thing. We'll talk about some of the experiments we're running later on. Okay, so what I thought I'd do is give you a quick sort of view into how we talk to our customers about what's going on and why they should make a change. A lot of the customers that we work with in EMC are very, very big. They're not the small startups who understand the value of DevOps. They're very big companies, finance, bank, that kind of stuff. And they know they have to change, but they're not quite sure how. So I thought I'd give you an insight into how we can help them change. So the first thing I normally do is show them this slide, which scares the bejesus out of them. If they aren't already aware that they're going to be disrupted, they soon will be. So we talk about the fact that they know and are aware of lots of new startups coming up and biting at their market share, and they need to become more like those competitors. So then we talk about, what some examples of those might be. And again, I know you've gone through this over the last day, so I won't spend too much time on that. And then what we do is we map it to what we see as being the kind of 3 dimensions of disruption. So if you look at these startups, and if you look at the big companies that have evolved successfully, what is it that's common about their approach? And we kind of boil it into these three sections, two of which I'll talk about, one of which I won't today. So obviously DevOps, which is why we're here. So a lot of the new startups and disruptors are using DevOps, using agile development, using CI/CD to speed up time to market for their experiments. Again, it feeds back to the experiments, right? Cloud native. So what they're creating can leverage all of the great stuff that's out there in terms of cloud, public or private. So they're writing microservices, they're writing 12-factor app compliant apps so that they can deploy these apps really fast on wherever they want. And that's, again, some of the things that we're seeing with these very new startups. And the third one is that everything's data-driven, which means that they are really, truly, empirically experimenting. They're not just guessing about what works. They're using data to really verify that things are actually working. And we're doing the same thing internally. So we're saying, before we do anything, and I'll talk about the experiment that we're running at the moment, before we do anything, let's work out how we measure the success of that thing, and let's try and get that feedback as quickly as possible. And underlying all of those things, we see that they are flexible platforms, okay? Container services, platform as a service, data lakes, infrastructure as a service, those are all sort of common themes. Anybody ever heard of CaaS, C-A-A-S? Is it been mentioned yesterday? Container as a service. I know. I'm always impressed with the new acronyms with AS at the end, but there you go. So container as a service is the new thing, supposedly. So the idea is taking the kind of opinionated PaaS approach, but making it more open so that you can actually have all of the stuff that you get with things like Cloud Foundry. You can have it for when you're using containers, and I'll go into that in a bit more detail later on. So Gartner, big fan of Gartner. Hope you guys are too. I think they're pretty sensible chaps. They quite clearly, and I like this, quite clearly say that actually doing DevOps and being cloud native are two different things. And I think people blur those two messages quite a lot, right? So I think EMC is guilty of doing this to some degree. You know, implementing something like Pivotal Cloud Foundry does not give you a DevOps culture, right? It is simply an opinionated PaaS that helps with the deployment, if you like, of the services. But it isn't the same thing as DevOps. DevOps is a completely different thing. Those two things are symbiotic, right? You create cloud-native apps. You can do them faster if you're using DevOps. DevOps leads into that kind of approach of having independent services as well, so you can deploy more often. So those two things do feed into each other. But right now, as the market stands, they're kind of implemented and supported by different technologies. So we shouldn't blur them too much at the moment. So as Gartner says, DevOps and cloud-native PaaS are not necessarily achieved equally by any one technology. Of course, that's changing. It's changing fast, and it may well be that we'll have that hybrid CaaS in the near future. So when you look at DevOps, the way Gartner talks about it, and I agree with this, it's when you're looking at improving your DevOps workflow, it appears the best way to do it is using some form of container service, so using some form of Docker management framework, and that's certainly what we're seeing in the industry. So when I go out and talk to customers about what they're doing, most customers today are using Docker in some form. How many people in this room have used Docker? There you go, exactly. How many people in this room have used Pivotal Cloud Foundry? Look at that. How many people in this room have used open source Cloud Foundry? Yeah, still small, right? So Docker is the wave at the moment, right? It is the container management system that works really well. But, as you'll see from what Gartner says, it's got some issues, it's got some challenges. If you are going down the cloud-native route, Docker's saying go for some form of opinionated PaaS. So this is where you would choose something like Cloud Foundry or similar, okay, where you're actually leveraging an opinionated platform as a service that gives you lots and lots of services and gives you an environment to deploy your apps on, which means that you can do things very, very quickly. You don't have to worry about spinning up application servers, databases. It gives you all those data services for free. But the downside is it's very opinionated. So you have to change the way you do things. So if you choose to go with an opinionated PaaS, and this is what we've seen as well, it means massive cultural changes within an organization. So much so that what we find is, very much like in The Innovator's Dilemma, another good book to read, you find organizations tend to have like spin-off departments that do this. They'll spin off an incubation or innovation group which uses opinionated PaaS. So they build new applications, they're building new mobile applications, and they're able to use an opinionated PaaS because they're actually creating applications today that tick all the boxes in terms of 12-factor apps. But the reality is, if you look at most large organizations that have been around for a couple of years, they've got a huge amount of legacy that they need to deal with. And that's not going to necessarily work today on something like Cloud Foundry, not without a lot of rework. So our advice is don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Certainly Cloud Foundry is fantastic and similar opinionated PaaS. There are other PaaSes on the market. Those kinds of opinionated PaaSes are brilliant and are probably going to be the future, probably. However, today, you can get huge amounts of benefits by looking at things like Docker, by using continuous integration and continuous delivery pipelines with maybe a different unit of deployment, not being the app, but being a container. And within that container, you've got a little bit more free will, right? You don't have to necessarily be 12-factor app compliant, right? You can be a little bit more flexible. So we're definitely seeing that in the market. That's 100%. So the summary from Gartner, again, I would concur with. Using Docker as an enabler for DevOps. So if you want to start, and I think we all have, but if you're going to people and you're helping them on that first step, using something like Docker to help you understand what the impact and changes that continuous delivery will bring to your organization, it's a fantastic start. Start using it for development and test. And that's what we're seeing. Again, I've got a number of customers that I've gone out to see and they're saying, well, we've not made anything live yet. However, our dev and test, all CD pipelines driven by Docker. The problem is, when they get to go to production, they don't believe right now there is a production-ready platform for them. So they're essentially honing their DevOps skills using Docker because it's so consumable, it's so easy to get started with. And what you're actually doing when you're doing this is you're hitting the hardest problems. And the hardest problems in this kind of transformation are not technology. The hardest problems in these kinds of transformations are process and people. Okay, I'm sure you've all found this. Getting people to change the way they work, to change what they have ownership of, is actually the hardest battle and is the hardest change. So why not, instead of focusing on the technology too much, why not see how you can make those changes in an organization by using something very consumable, very easy to pick up like Docker, because you will immediately start bouncing into those kinds of constraints. Immediately you'll start bouncing into potentially certain security people saying, oh no, you can't deploy that. No, that doesn't meet my security guidelines. You've got to solve that problem at some point. Why not solve it now without doing a huge amount of technology investment? Also, you may have a bit of pushback from the application developers who say, do you know, I don't want to have to worry about all of these services. Why am I having to build containers with application services in them? Why can't I just build my app? So again, you might be changing the way that they think about their jobs and their roles. They may want to think about actually the downstream activities, right? So not only are you building your app, and I am a developer and was a developer, but you're also making it such that it can run in production. You're not throwing it over the wall. That kind of change in mindset happens when you do this. And you don't have to spend an awful lot of time and money rolling out lots and lots of technology. But the kicker is, right now, productionizing it is tricky. We'll talk about some solutions that we've seen later on. And finally, Gartner says, don't build a PaaS with Docker. I would actually say, don't build a PaaS at all, unless you can help it. And I've got a great slide later on which shows why that might be the case. Here it is. Platform as a service. What does platform as a service mean? if you're going to build your own, whether it be Docker-based or, like PCF, more app-centric, then you've got to consider all of these items, right? That is no mean feat. Today, there are no, as far as I'm aware anyway, no services that you get, no management frameworks you get that will tick all those boxes unless you go for something like an opinionated PaaS. So building your own is very hard work, right? Now, it doesn't stop a lot of people. In fact, a lot of the EMC customers that we work with, I've mentioned, are very big banks, for example, who have a huge IT operations division. And so they're very happy to build something like this out because it keeps them gainfully employed probably for the next 5-10 years. And they're doing it. So I know of one example at least where a particular bank is building out an entire framework based on Docker. So it's ticking all these boxes. It's a really interesting project, but it's really, really hard, and you need hundreds of people involved, and it's a lot of money. So what we're also seeing, and this is based on another conference that a few of us went to, and we kind of went around and did a bit of a secret Squirrel mission, and we kind of asked people what they were doing. So don't quote me on this is kind of very secret. But this is what we got. This is some of the feedback, the unofficial feedback we got from some conferences that we attended recently. The Financial Times, for example, is actually using microservices. So they've gone that next step, but they're running it on Docker, and they're using AWS. We've got a lot of Docker and Kubernetes. I'm seeing a huge amount of that. Probably more than other management frameworks at the moment. Kubernetes appears to be very, very popular at the moment. We have got some people using open source Cloud Foundry, so the government digital service. So when you go on gov.co.uk, they're actually using open source Cloud Foundry, which is quite cool. And Microsoft using Mesos. We've got an example of how we're using Mesos coming up. So I think from my point of view, and again, trying to be consistent with the way that Gartner presents things and what we're seeing in the market, is if you want to move to a cloud-native DevOps environment, you want to move to that culture, you want to do both things, right? Then it's a step-by-step approach. You're not going to be able to flick a switch and do both. And what appears to be a sensible way forward, and what a lot of people are doing, is they're starting off with DevOps, they're starting off with Docker, they're starting off with not necessarily changing their applications that much. Obviously, some changes need to be made to some applications to even get them to run in a container, but they're kind of going for the low-hanging fruit. So step one, find the apps with very minimal changes required that could run in a container, and start using things like Docker and Docker management frameworks to start honing your skills. And what you're actually then doing, potentially, if you've got a good landing site for that container that is supported, you're actually starting to get some returns on investment. So you'll be starting to save money, you'll be starting to get stuff out to the market quicker, you will actually be starting to deploy a lot faster. So step one gives you gains immediately without necessarily going through this huge microservice architecture leap. Step two could be, once you've got to that point and you understand some of the issues, constraints, and some of the challenges with working in this new environment, step two could be then looking at the applications and saying, okay, so I've got this big monolith at the moment and I'm deploying it all in one go. Wouldn't it be much better if I broke it up so that I could deploy things a little bit smaller, make changes smaller, and start looking at a microservice environment and microservice architecture? And in that point, if you are starting to re-architect your applications, it might be time to think about using something like an opinionated PaaS. You don't have to, but the advantages with that would be you don't have to worry about all the services that the application requires because you're going to get it for free with the PaaS. Okay, so it takes a lot of load off the development team, and it takes a lot of load off the operations teams, but obviously it means that you do have to work in a very strict way because you have to adhere to the services that the PaaS supports, and you have to also adhere to the application architecture that the PaaS supports as well. It's why it's called an opinionated PaaS. So step two could be start using something like Cloud Foundry for your refactored applications. It could be that those things live in parallel for a very long time. So they're not necessarily sequential. And what we've created, and this is the MVP I mentioned, this is something that we're creating internally at the moment. You may have heard of the public product called Native Hybrid Cloud that EMC's put out there. That's kind of the right-hand side of this slide and the bottom of the slide. It's essentially an OpenStack supported appliance with Cloud Foundry sitting on top of it and a few extra features. And the idea is that if you want to use an opinionated PaaS, and you also need to have some form of control over your environment, so you can't push your stuff out to public cloud today, then this gives you a very easy way to get started. We can get this up and running in a data center in less than a week, right? Compared to building out your own OpenStack, that's actually very quick. And it's a supported appliance. So the right-hand side and the bottom, the Native Hybrid Cloud, that's a publicly sellable option, as is the Neutrino stuff at the moment. What we're doing in my team at the moment is we've recognized that if we try and just sell that, if we go to customers and go, do you want a PCF appliance? They're going to say, well, I'm using Docker, or I'm using Kubernetes, or I'm using Marathon and Mesos. How's that going to work? So what we're doing is we're creating this stepping stone approach. So we have got a successful implementation of actually Mesos and Marathon, it doesn't have to be those, running on top of this OpenStack appliance in parallel to Native Hybrid Cloud, PCF. So, doesn't really matter what your application portfolio needs. There is a target destination. Doesn't matter if you've already made a significant investment in Docker, because we can support it. And as I say, this is an MVP, this is an experiment. It may well be that we need to pivot and change out for Kubernetes. Well, I was speaking to a person just an hour ago who was saying, we're seeing much more Kubernetes than Mesos. Fine, we'll flip it onto Kubernetes. The idea this is showing the art of the possible and is showing that opinionated PaaS is not going to be the 100% answer for DevOps. Docker probably answers a lot of those questions. And if you can have a framework that supports both, then you're probably onto a winner. Now, long term or short term, if you want to spin out to a public cloud, then that's fine. You don't have to use the OpenStack appliance. Everything you've created on top is perfectly runnable on AWS, for example. So again, it gives you flexibility for those 3 steps at the bottom. So our tips then, just to summarize, be pragmatic, obviously. Not one size fits all. We're definitely seeing that in the market. We're definitely seeing there is a play for opinionated PaaS, but it tends to be on kind of satellite divisions that are able to create new applications. And then those existing applications tend to be being modernized, if you like, or certainly deployed faster using a more Docker-based approach. Whichever approach you use, if you are making that transition internally, don't try and boil the ocean. So what we do is we go into customers and say, right, let's do like we did in the Phoenix project. Let's map your value to deployment chain. So from the very start where you've got a requirement or you've got a change, what does that look like in terms of getting it out to production? Map it, go through all the steps, and then work out in those steps where you've got bottlenecks. Find out then from those bottlenecks where you can make an improvement quickly. And that's your first MVP for DevOps. Essentially going through that as is and to be mapping of the workflow to get you from a requirement to production feeds into a backlog of experiments for DevOps. And that's what you iteratively do. And whilst you're doing that, what you're also doing is you're looking at the culture changes and process changes required to implement those things. But you're not doing a wholly massive rollout of process change. You're basing it on a real experiment that's providing real value, hopefully, by speeding up a bottleneck. And you're changing those processes that fit that specific experiment. So it's very incremental. It's very experiment-driven. It's very much lean startup 101, but based on DevOps. And out of that, you will get incremental process change. So start by proving DevOps, then incrementally build it out. Do not forget the process and people changes. You probably won't have the luxury of forgetting, because if you try and change something, you will come up against it. So take it into account, change your processes and people, even again if it's just small scale. So you might want to use a satellite organization to do this, but at least you know, you understand what the process changes need to be to make this work. So we had a good example of this recently where we went out to a company and they were deploying changes, and we went to the as is and to be map, and it was very clear that the bottleneck, the biggest bottleneck, wasn't technology necessarily. It was a manual checklist that the security person had to go through to choose that, or to check that what we were deploying was compliant. And that was apparent, it was totally obvious from everybody in the room that it was a week-long process. There was one person doing it, and she had a massive backlog. And that was the thing that was stopping them going from 4-week deployments to 2-day deployments. How could we have made that better? Loads of different ways. Didn't necessarily need to put any technology in, but we could have done things like automate some of the testing so that the security then becomes automatically compliant, right? So create a test profile that you run against your applications that actually double checks what the security person is doing manually. That's an easy one. But it's going to mean that person may well lose their job. It's going to mean definitely a process change individually, and it might also mean that you've got to go and talk to the external auditors, that are the people that actually check your security compliance. So just that one small little MVP, that one small change, could have meant quite a big impact to that organization. But if implemented, would have made huge differences to the deployment time. We're still working on that at the moment. So at the moment, they've chosen to do a different MVP, and that is the customer's choice, which is a little less controversial. However, they're not going to get the gains that we've identified in terms of the time to market. So how are we doing for time? Timekeeper? He's lost it.
9 minutes.
9 minutes left. Gosh, what am I going to say for 9 minutes? So I'm just going to go through a couple of success stories. I've mentioned a few case studies already, but just a couple of things that we've done recently, which kind of overlap from PaaS and DevOps, which you may or may not have heard about. They're fairly publicly well known, but we'll talk about it anyway. So the first one. This is a really fun one. I love all these IoT projects, having smart toasters and smart washing machines and all that kind of stuff. And that's what this is, right? This is essentially using telematics, using electronics within devices, and being able to bubble that up to a central platform, creating a marketplace for providers and vendors to create new applications to be able to utilize that kind of data as well. So, the use cases, and we've seen it all before, you've got a washing machine, it's smart enough to be sending data back up to this central hub of when it needs a service, and me as a maintenance person can write an application that can automatically email you when your service is up and say, by the way, we've got an offer on Beth for a cheap service today. So that kind of use case. So we've created that platform. So actually this has been a federation approach. So EMC, Pivotal, VMware, all together have created this platform to be able to help the IoT use case. It's based on Cloud Foundry, and it works. It's also based on VMware underneath the hood as well. And what we've also done is created a continuous delivery pipeline as well, using the same old standards that most people use, Git, Jenkins, and so on. So successful, it's like an AWS-like experience is the way we'd like to push it. And it's using Cloud Foundry at the moment. So obviously, some of the challenges with that are the applications that are landing on it. And this is what we're learning today. We're learning today that just letting anybody write any kind of application to land on this probably isn't a good idea. We do need to give them some kind of guidance in terms of 12-factor apps, in terms of how to talk to messaging and so on. So we're iteratively learning how this platform really does work. And again, you can argue that's partly down to maybe the opinionated PaaS we're using underneath. It would be interesting to know how it would have played out if we'd used something like Docker containers, but we'll never know. So The next one, and that one is actually very publicly well known, is Daimler Connected Car. So we have a mobile app that connects to your car and allows you to interact with your car in real time, and is smart enough to send, again, all this telematics up to a central hub somewhere. So again, hybrid approach, federation approach using EMC, Pivotal, and VMware, created a continuous delivery pipeline and using Cloud Foundry to land the application on. Pivotal wrote the app. We created the platform as a service layer based on Cloud Foundry, and VMware provided the infrastructure as a service underneath. And again, that's gone live in Germany, and we're now rolling it out into Mexico as well. So watch this space. It may well come to a car near you soon. So in summary, and I've only got a few minutes left, I do want to emphasize that I've talked a lot about technology. I've talked a lot about different solutions, native hybrid cloud, Docker, and so on. The reality is the biggest problem that we face when we're helping at least larger scale customers move into this new world is people and process. Those things are exponentially harder to change than flipping technology. Whether I use Jenkins or Hudson really doesn't matter. Whether or not I use Cloud Foundry or something else doesn't really matter. Changing the organizational structure so that operations might have less control, so that development teams might have to do more, so that I might have to make certain people redundant, for example, in security, just as an example. That's massive. Those things take huge amounts of organizational change. So don't forget, when you're going through this iterative process, it's not just about tools. And I think, and I'm guilty of this because I am from a technical development background, I focus always on technology. I go, right, can this work functionally? Yes. So why has it never actually been rolled out in production then? It's not because it doesn't work, it's because the organization isn't ready for it. So don't forget it. Don't play it down. In fact, probably estimate 10 times more than you think it's going to take to make those changes. And the best way of doing it is to show the value of the change, which is why we talk about those DevOps MVPs. If you can turn around to an organization and show just by making this one change, we have increased time to market, or decreased time to market, we have reduced quality, increased quality, my brain is going. We've reduced errors, increased quality, just by showing a small experiment, and the result of that experiment, you will get buy-in from those people in the organization that can make changes. So that's the key thing. It's less push and more pull. And you do that by experimentation. My final recommended read, it's not up there. And again, you might not understand or think why it's correlated to DevOps, but reading something like The Lean Startup by Eric Ries is a really great way of getting your mindset into this constant experimentation process. Because what we're talking about is change. And the only safe way to do change is to experiment to see if that change is going to be successful or not. It's not just to roll out massive amounts of documentation, roll out massive amounts of process change without testing it out. So using that kind of mentality of iterative MVPs with very clear objective success criteria that you can then go and showcase to your operations team or your dev team or to your business and say, this is why we want to change, because we have just pushed this app out, which was taking a month in a day, or even better, we've pushed 1,000 apps today, 1,000 changes today. And it gives you the buy-in. It's not hard, it's not easy by any means, it's hard to do. Iteratively managing change is much harder in some respects, which is why people tend to default to the old way of doing things and writing large business documents, writing large design documents, and then doing the change, because it's easier in theory to manage, but it will fail. It will fail. It fails for software delivery, it fails for process change, it fails for any kind of change you're trying to do. You've got to do it iteratively. So I think that's it in terms of what I wanted to say. If there's any questions, I don't know how you want to format that. Yeah? Thank you very much for your attention. Thanks for staying awake.
Thank you so much, Beth. Is there any question in the room? I got a question. I've read on your the very last slide, DevOps transformation.
Yeah.
I'm always wondering, looking back to the kind of history of the IT when we started to evangelize Agile.
Yes.
So there was a little bit, looking back, it sounded a little bit like propaganda. If you do Agile, you get into paradise someday. Yeah. And now we're speaking about DevOps transformation. If you do DevOps, you get into paradise someday. Probably new challenges are going to occur. Do we have maybe an insight in some organizations which are quite far the road, yeah, towards DevOps? What kind of new questions and challenges are usually arising?
It's a really good question. So, in fact, very similar challenges to when we implemented Agile. It's the same kind of thing. So, the organizations that we've worked with that have been most successful in this area are people that have got those kinds of executive level sponsorship, that are able to essentially dictate to people who are naysayers. So I'll give you an example. We had a very large bank in the Netherlands, and we were rolling out a huge, big cloud with them, and we were rolling out cloud services. And for a whole year, we were doing lots and lots of work, but had no delivery. Nothing was going live. So we came in actually with an agile coach, not a DevOps coach, just an agile coach, just to kind of understand what it was that was causing the pain, what it was that was causing the bottleneck. And just by actually using agile principles, we actually managed to flip things around and get the executive sponsors in the room when people were arguing over what should and shouldn't change, and turning around and saying to people, it is going to happen this way, whether or not you like it or not. I'm sorry, but we are going to do it this way. So very similar to agile transformation, executive level sponsorship, having somebody that's done it before in the room that can hold your hand through it, and just being brave, because you're going to get a huge amount of pushback.
Any more questions? Yes, please.
How is EMC going to deal with Dell? Because
I'm so glad you asked that question. That's a round of applause for that question.
Because Dell is obviously and absolutely it's absolutely obvious that Dell and Michael Dell are trying to turn back everything to plain hardware. And there are some rumors that they are trying to get rid of the whole software and security stack that Dell has already on board.
There are lots of rumors, I would agree. However, my understanding, and again, I probably don't know a huge amount more than you, only in the sense that it's still very much under the wraps, but my understanding is that Dell themselves believe they need to change. Dell themselves believe, just like EMC has believed for a long time, that hardware is commoditized and is not the future. They have to raise themselves up the stack. So my understanding is that Dell will go through a significant change themselves in terms of what they want to achieve. And we won't be a hardware company, just a 100% hardware company, because we'll be out of business in 5 years. I think that's the message that we're being told internally. And it makes sense. Because would you, really, if you were Michael Dell? I wouldn't. No. Hopefully that answers the question without me getting fired.
Okay, so thank you very much. Please give a warm applause to Beth Brown.
Thank you.